All right, welcome to Magical Mushroom Part 2. So tonight we're going to look at, last class I covered the more practical use of mushrooms in magic, as well as talking about cultures. So tonight we're going to talk about more of fungi and the mushrooms' impact on the environment, which includes the mycelium network. We'll be talking about some of the medicinal use of mushrooms in cultures. So that's going to cover that, as well as for the mushroom rings or fairy rings, as they're called, and different cultures that has stories related to the fairy rings. All right, next slide, please. So for the mycelium network, so the interesting thing for the mycelium network, so you can think of it almost as the highway of the forest. So to give an idea, mycelium is the tiny threads that connects the fungi to the various trees and plants throughout an area. So for example, a forest, a woodlands. And the interesting for that is it's a mutual relationship. The fungi get something, the trees and plants get something, and it helps create that vibrant environment that you'll see in a forest or a woodland. So mycelium transports water, carbon, nitrogen the mycelium transports water, carbon, nitrogen, and other mineral nutrients to the various trees and plants within. And what the trees and plants are providing to the fungi is they're providing sugar and other nutrients that it needs to grow. And it's a very symbiotic relationship. Next slide, please. So the larger network, so for the mycelium that's connected to all these plants and trees, it's called the mycorrhizal network. And to give the impact of it, so what you'll see is that there's a lot of growth in the woods and the forests where it has all the different fungi, mushrooms, and the plants and trees. In areas where you do not find a lot of fungus and the mushrooms, which is the reproductive bodies of the fungus, you'll see there's not as much growth, or it's much more stunted. The trees would not be able to connect to other trees and plants, and as a result, the nutrients and the resources that goes from one tree to another, as well as to the fungi, would be much more limited. All right, next slide, please. So on this next slide gives a perfect example of what you would see for the mycelium. So this was just one of the examples that I could find for mycelium. Next slide, please. And then those were just a couple other different examples for it. All right, and then next slide. And then next slide again. All right, and then so to move on to the next part. So something interesting that I was able to find was a TED Talk from 2008. It's from Paul Statements, Statemets. He's a mycologist, and he did for the 2008 TED Talk. He said he did his presentation on how mushrooms can save the world, which gave 6 different ways that mushrooms can be used to help improve the world. One example he gave was mushrooms can be used for antibiotics. Certain poxes can be treated with antibiotics made from the mushrooms. That was one example he gave. Another one he gave was in regards to samples of the soil and the difference between soils that have the fungi versus samples that didn't. So they took the example they gave in the TED Talk was that he had two different samples, one without the fungi in the mycelium network, one with. The one without had no growth over a several week period. The one that did had a whole little ecosystem growing in it that you would not normally have seen growing in that type of soil sample. And he also wrote a book. Oh, here we go. Mycelium running. So if you want to look up a little bit more information on where he goes even further into the discussion about mycelium and mushrooms and how can it save the world, he goes further from his TED Talk, which was only 30 minutes, to a whole book that goes into a much more detailed explanation on the fungi and the mycelium connection and how it heals the world.
What's the name of that book?
It's called Mycelium Running. Next slide, please. So we're going to move on to the next part of the subject. So just to conclude for the first part of the class for the mycelium network, it's like the highway of the woodland areas, forests, the woodlands. Provides nutrients, provides carbon, nitrogen. And without it, you would see a dramatic change to the environment. You would have nowhere near as much woodland growth. The trees wouldn't be able to communicate, and you'd see like areas that's have devastation to it. You'll see a lot of those fungi and the mushroom growth will still be there and helping with the decaying of the area. Whereas if you don't have those growth, you just see that's dead space. So what was interesting that I found out for the cultures, so they had as early as the 5th century, there was an alchemist called Tao Hong Jing who used Lingzi mushrooms for medicinal use. And they also had some brews that were used for more of the psychedelic side or spiritual use, which was more for the nobility and the more powerful individuals of society back then. That was one of the ones there, and then the Hippocrates, am I saying that right?
Hippocrates?
Hippocrates, yes, thank you. Used the amadou mushrooms for wounds and for inflammation. So you had the Greeks, you've had it in Asia, and then we have Otzi, the Iceman, who was found to have used amadou mushrooms and birch polypore mushrooms to survive his times in the Alps of northern Italy. Now, some of the more modern day applications of mushrooms has been to use it in alternatives for meat. So similar to soy, they also have mushrooms. They also have it used for packing materials and for nutritional supplements. Like you can find mushroom nutritional supplements in like Walmart, Target, that's supposed to help with your immune system and inflammation.
I use that. I find it.
Yeah, I find that it helps
I
helps
put
a
a
lot.
teaspoon in my coffee every morning.
I think we found
That
it,
works.
we found it at Walmart, it's like mushroom root or something like that, I forgot what it was called.
Yeah, it's got like.
The seven
lion's
different-
mane and
Seven different
the
mushrooms.
most common ones, yeah.
The non-deadly ones.
No, no, no.
Well, I mean,
You would no longer have information you need, but
you wouldn't have employees.
And then in the first magical mushroom class, we were more covering more of the gods, goddesses, and more of like Egyptians, the Greek, in more of the religious manner, where it's more focused on life, death, rebirth, and their views of it in their everyday life then. Now, this time we're covering the medicinal use, talk about more of how they use it for that. And for across the ages that you'll find, which was discussed in the first class as well, was that for the psychedelic mushrooms, they were used a lot from the ancient ages till current, where they'll use it for spiritual use or to see things that you would not normally see. Now, the last topic for the class is in regards to the Fae. So the link to the Fae, so the fairy rings, or as in some areas we call it elf rings or the witch's ring. These circle of mushrooms have names in folklore, and most of it's around Western Europe. So we've got France, we got Germany, the Celtic, we have Celtic roots for some of it. Now, one of the interesting thing that I found for is the oldest one found in France was 700 years old for the oldest fairy ring. Now, there was a common theme with most of the folklore. So no matter what area, with the exception to one or two cultures like the Welsh actually has one where they can bring good fortune and prosperity. Everywhere else, you see the common theme related to misfortune and mischief and it being a bad thing. Now, one of the most common ones for that is, there's a Scottish rhyme for it. He what tills the fairies' greens, nay luck again shall hae. And he what spills the fairy ring, betide him wanton way. For weirdless days and weary nights are his till his dying day. But he what gaze by the fairy ring, nor dole nor pine shall see. And he what cleans the fairy rings, an easy death shall be. And another example of that they gave was that there's a tale from Ireland of a farmer who built a barn within the fairy ring, and that he became ill with a sickness, and that he dreamt that he needed to burn down the barn. It is rumored that those who dance in the fairy ring will be enthralled by the charm of the Fae, though not all legends have the Fae as dangerous as those. The one example that I found for that is the legend of the town of Corian, Corwrion, with the fairies nimbly dancing around the glowworm on the rising ground. And it talks about how the fairy rings would bring about bountiful crops and that the plants and grass nearby would flourish. So it's one of actual prosperity.
I know, growing up, we're surprised, big Irish family. But, right, big surprise, but, it was always, just talked about you don't fall asleep in a fairy ring, right? Because it's, when they talk about misfortune, you know, some of the stories where if you fell asleep, you wake up and you might be in the land of the Fae and you might seem to only spend one day or one night, but when you come back, everyone you know is gone.
Yeah,
Because they've all died.
Rip Van Winkle kind of.
Yeah, it is a, yes, a Rip Van Winkle.
not
kind of
eat
thing.
anything.
Like one
because
day is
then
like
just-
probably-
Well, then you're stuck, but yeah,
Yeah.
maybe, but yeah, so you should always just leave them be and not, definitely don't knock them over,
Exactly.
definitely.
yeah.
They were of the route of being respectful
Mhm.
to leave the fairy ring alone, to leave it in its natural order. Don't mess with it. Don't stand in it. Don't.
Yeah,
Don't
It's almost
piss
like
off
a
the fan.
respect,
Exactly.
it's also like almost like a respectable fear. It's like, it's not like a fear like, oh, mom, I'm afraid of them, it's more like I respect your power enough to not touch you.
To not piss you off.
Exactly.
It's more than that, so as far as what I've always been taught, whatever that, the Fae, some of them more happy, and then they have ones that are, like, whatever, but the vast majority of them are amoral. They don't have our sense of morality. They have their own thing. So what we would perceive to be, how can they do that? They don't have the same kind of feeling, like, like you're saying, like, just things be better just to kind of leave them be, and because they might not even realize they're hurting you because they don't feel things like that way.
so the cultural norm was always that was a crossover.
Yeah.
I guess,
Mhm.
almost like a gateway,
Mhm.
temporary one.
Like a crossroads.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Type
like
of
a crossroads, just,
crossroads.
where they've touched for a minute and.
Well,
Yeah,
a fairy ring introduced Carl and I to Elsbeth,
Oh,
who now embodies our road witch. We were just walking through a cemetery, as we do.
Casually.
Wisconsin, looking at different, see who's there or whatever.
some of the most fun ever.
And
Part of,
yeah,
it is.
and on this, there's a tombstone and a mound and a perfect fairy ring of mushrooms on the mound.
Mm.
And the person who on the tombstone was Elsbeth. From what dates?
She was 100 years old when she
She was
died.
100 years old.
Yeah, it was like 1809 to 1909.
Oh, it's like 1,000 and up, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that she was like buried under this fairy ring, so, when I was creating the mannequin. I just remembered that and I said, Elspeth, would you like to be our witch and, of our group? And, she didn't say no, so I took it as a yes.
You don't say no,
She didn't check it.
I still wish we had those pictures because
The pictures did not come out, those before
didn't,
digital, before camera phones, we had an actual camera and the film came out blank.
There is absolutely.
There's a reason.
So you have to take our word for it.
Well, I tell you what, people may not see a coinky dink, but I've been places where Elspeth has, and I kid you not, I will turn half a second at the corner of my eye and I will see that, and I will swear, you cannot tell me otherwise. Now, it's a real person. I think.
Elspeth
They're right there with you.
She-
And sometimes when you walk by, she will like turn her head.
Yeah.
She does.
And then I would just say, hi, hey Elspeth,
She's always
and
friendly.
just keep going, because at the end of the day,
She is right.
one of us.
But yeah, she does.
You know?
She
Yeah,
moves.
she likes.
You don't love me, I don't love you.
Yeah, but that's right. She
You
likes.
can see at the events at times, you see her, she starts at one direction and then
Uh-huh.
by the end
Or
of
I'll
the
be like,
day, you're like.
or I'll walk past and I'll be like, I thought there was somebody there. Oh.
yeah, it usually doesn't matter where we set her up. Eventually, she winds up facing the ritual.
Yeah, it's like, you look at it, you're like, she's like this originally, and then by the end of the day, she's moved towards.
I thought of another question when, just now, because, yeah, mushrooms grow in rings. Is there any biological reason why the mushrooms grow in rings? I picture those pictures of the mycelium network underneath is like roots, or like a spider web coming out.
It's almost
So-
like a spider web across.
So they come out in a circle and those are their sex organs, so they're just like showing
Kinky.
off. man.
It's like, hey,
Like one of those fancy birds,
It's like,
Hey, we're here.
And you wonder why the fairies were dancing there.
I know.
Right.
Well,
No connection.
it's just amazing that they can grow in a perfect circle because it's
Well,
hard to draw a circle. That's right.
I couldn't find anything that showed like,
Why is the
proof.
circle?
showing proof of why they in circles, just the
The
only thing you
world,
can
I
really see is that
Kinda how many
it's all
states
across
they
the world, you can find it.
Well, I guess it's
So it's
just
under
their magic,
the
the
area.
fairies must grow them that way.
Well, it's just like a pentagram in nature,
Yeah,
you
Yeah,
know?
it shows up again
Those-
and again, yeah.
Those things are just,
they're always there,
That's
yeah.
just
Well,
Part of the magic of the world.
Right,
One
mycelium, yeah.
I always love about the mycelium network in trees is the role they play in forest fires. The mycelium network will pull water from one part of a forest to another part of the forest in order to give those trees more water so they can survive the fire. And part of the reason why the forest fires are getting worse is because with the global warming and the drought, there just isn't enough water for the mycelium to pull.
Yeah,
Yeah.
We've drained out too much of the groundwater in the west. And they just don't have anything to pull anymore that they can use to save themselves. And I wonder if the fact that they use that the forestry industry, how they plant like all one type of pine in equal distant rows. I wonder if part of the problem is those trees don't have the right mycelium networks under them.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
If they're bringing them in, it's not gonna.
Yeah, they're just
handle the
manually planting them in
yeah.
rows.
Yeah, because then it's unnatural, it's not
Yeah.
naturally occurring, it's. That's
So it
when you
might
get
not have
invasive
the same-
species.
a good forest has centuries of death and rot and rebirth.
Yeah, I mean, when I first saw the
That's not
mycelium
true.
network,
Go on the fallen trees.
it looks more like veins in a body, like lifeline and bloodline
Yeah,
naturally, and it spreads everywhere, right? You know, mushrooms are one of those things that they can eat all aspects.
Think of more like a neural network.
Yeah, well,
Yeah,
it-
brain.
right.
the bad ones,
Millions of
psychedelic ones,
different-
healthy ones, all different things are covered with mushrooms.
Continue, John?
Now,
Yeah.
now, I didn't go through them, but so to give an idea, some of the names that they had, so for France, they call them the witches' circles. German was the same thing, it was,
Hexen circle, say it in German.
You say it in German, not him.
Hexen circle.
oh no, I was that's not very well.
Probably starts with hexen. I don't know the word for circle though.
For Tyrol, they said it was the rings made by fairy tales of dragons. England said it was elf rings from elves dancing. And then for Celtic, it was the fairy rings from the Dancing of the Fae. Carl, can you go to the next slide, please?
Yes.
Sorry, I kind of forgot to keep
That's
going. So on that one there. So we got hypocrisy, we got the alchemist. So those were the examples that they gave for each one for that. Next slide, please. And then we got Otzi, the Iceman.
Mhm.
And then some of the examples that we've got there was related to the, I believe it was the Amadou and then the birch polyphore, if I remember right. And then that one was just giving the overview of the fairy rings, just giving the names, so that way the folks online was able to see the names as well. Next slide, please. And then that was the example of one of the fairy rings. Now, that's not the one from France. I could not find the picture of the oldest, but that was one that gave a good example of a forest fairy ring.
Do they have any of them have like a large mushroom at the side of the table? They like, do they ever get that big?
Not that I've seen, usually what I've seen for the ones that I could find was that there are some that go several centimeters around for distance wise, but most of the ones I've seen are all of the smaller mushrooms.
Gotcha.
There's the one network in the Pacific Northwest that's covered, I think they said it was something like.
1,000 acres.
Yeah,
The
it's
one
just
that's the
a
largest
crazy, but
living
it's-
organism on the planet.
It's an underground, it's part mycelium network part of it, but it's an underground mushroom, and they've determined that it is all through DNA testing, it's all the same organism.
Yo.
Which
Every
is
last bit of
crazy.
it. I mean, it covers
They're
miles.
far.
Miles. It's
They
all.
are
just-
eldritch beings.
On the bright side, if it ever rains, just hide under that thing.
What's underground?
It's underground.
Oh, okay, well, never mind. I mean, the worst.
You don't get one big mushroom the size of the table, you get hundreds. Yeah.
Yeah,
Because it's just sex organs.
and that's why.
That's
The
why
actual
that forest
spore
is
is
deeply-
the mycelial network underneath.
Forested and huge.
But if you ever go to the Great Smoky Mountains, the habitat changes so drastically up there that I went to 2 different waterfalls and they had 2 completely different set of mushrooms. Because of the the way the water flow, but also the elevation too and the humidity.
Gotcha.
Yeah, that's one of the things that,
Because you'll see like at most like big waterfalls, especially the one I had to climb up 68 stairs that were not even.
Oh, jeez.
Some of them you take
Dark into the
one step, and then you have to do 5 steps and then go up.
yeah, I stayed home that day.
You stayed home. But that one had a bunch of logs coming across at the base of it
Mhm.
that has fallen, and you can see the different mushrooms with the fresh water growing, and it was so beautiful.
So it turns the trees into soil.
Mushrooms love logs.
Yes.
Dark and damp.
It's good for the growth.
Absolutely.
The big saucery ones that stick out of the stumps.
Yeah,
Even in the Everglades, there's this one little mangrove down there, like one little grove area that has like the huge giant trees that has fallen over throughout the years with the hurricanes, and you can see the mushrooms growing among the roots, and the roots is like taller than me sticking up.
yeah, there have been times which I go out there in the grass and it's wet and dewy after we've all had those days. And you see little tiny gray mushrooms that are floating around the ground. Half a second there, I might want to take one there and eat them, but I never do because just saying.
No,
Because you're still here. We know you never do.
I mean, when I was younger, at my grandparents' old house, not the house they have now, but the one they had in like Cresthaven, there were mushrooms outside the house, and I was like, when I was younger, I was like, I had this really big like mushroom kick, and I really liked eating mushrooms out of a can. And I remember walking outside going to my grandparents going, "Oh, Papa, there's mushrooms. Let me eat them." He goes, "You don't want to eat those."
Not those.
He like would go. I'm like, "But why? They're mushrooms." He goes, "You don't want to eat the ones that are on the ground. We only eat the ones that are in the can."
That's a good rule of thumb.
So, yes.
And when you're like 5 or 6, you believe it. I'm like,
Well,
okay.
when in doubt.
If it's not in the can, it's not safe. I'm like, okay.
Not all
Trust that.
mushrooms are,
Even then, you wanna cook them just in
Yeah.
case.
Yeah.
Very few.
Not
you
even
wanna-
some of them, I read that there's some mushrooms that you can eat raw, but if you cook it, it makes them deadly. I read
Yeah, that could be.
I read that.
Yeah,
but
those are
birds-
the ones you would wanna be cautious with either way though.
Like birds with some vegetables and fruits and vegetables like mushrooms, like I can give them certain types of mushrooms, but they have to be cooked. They cannot be given raw because there's like a toxin in some of them that if they were to eat it and digest it, it would kill them.
That's
well, not only that,
that's
but
true
you
for a
know,
lot of
you ever
berries and that.
actually ate like part of a mushroom leaf in your mouth without cooking it? Oh, it tastes like sandpaper. It's horrible.
Tastes like dirt.
Yeah.
It's like
I mean, well, if it
frozen.
I was like, if it did, it tastes like dirt.
Eat the napkin over there.
I love sauteed.
Then, next slide, please. So the next slide there, so that just went more through. This slide just went through just a little bit more of the breakdown between good and more of the fearful or respective side. Where there's only one culture that was showing it more in a positive light, where the other ones were more of the. It's to be feared and respected. Is the best way to put it. Where if you were to violate that space, then you would be met with misfortune.
So the Welsh mushrooms are just friendlier.
No, Welsh are just crazy.
You trade with them, then.
And more of their interaction with the Fae was probably more of one that was.
Yeah,
One that they.
Wales is very rocky, very poor soil, so if you have mushrooms growing, your soil's very good.
Well, yeah, it's
Yeah,
a
it
good
has a lot to
sign.
do with it,
Yes.
yes.
They
That
have
would make
mushrooms
sense,
is good.
yeah.
Yeah, and then if you fall asleep and you wake up and all your in-laws are gone.
Hey,
Free time.
you're no longer wanted for all those cattle you stole.
I mean,
Then you're
doing
just
it all,
3
it's like-
centuries later in the feud over those cattle you stole.
I think one of the reasons why they have such a negative is because they're found around death.
Yes.
Decay
Yeah.
and darkness
Yeah.
and,
Mhm.
cause when you think of
And
mushrooms, oh,
probably,
sorry.
you know, some people probably tried to eat them and then died.
Yeah, they weren't excavated, yeah.
There's that.
But Well, cause if you think about it, when you think of like fairy rings and like whole mushrooms and everything, you think of the fae, mushrooms are grown in darkness and, you know.
Well, and it might be a good excuse too for why someone died after eating the mushrooms. Oh, they're not dead. They just went to the fairy realm and they'll be back in 300 years.
There actually is, in the world of Super Mario Brothers, when the creator went and did it, there's actually almost, that when you eat it, with the spots kind of thing, it gives the hallucination, it gives you the feeling that you have grown or shrunk, like
Mhm.
chemically kind of thing.
That's that
Yeah.
Alice in Wonderland type stuff.
That's Alice in Wonderland, yeah.
They put it in the video game, hence.
Well, yeah, that's why you eat the mushroom to get.
It must be
I
true.
mean, they did
Yeah, I'll
say
give
the
it that.
writer of Alice in Wonderland was on shrooms, so, you know.
He was.
He was.
Yeah, yeah,
It's in a video game, it must be true.
just not these.
That's a very cute mushroom.
It is.
Not those ones, those ones. Next slide, please. And then that was one of the examples that were given for what could happen if you were to go into a fairy circle.
Hmm.
So that one was the example they gave of being charmed by the fae and
Dancing?
I mean,
You start dancing.
Yep. start dancing.
can I do that?
It's nice at first, but after a couple hours.
Yeah, that's what, that, yeah, they start talking about
Dancing and you
dancing
can't
too.
stop.
Yep.
Yeah.
Mhm.
As long as you come back out, that's it.
Mama Gina has a great song about falling asleep, waiting for AAA to come pick her up on the
Oh,
road.
yeah.
She had fallen asleep in the fairy ring, and the dream she had while she was waiting for AAA.
And as far as Mr. Donovan here going, oh, well, it's all fun and good. You'll be dancing forever. And I was like, nah, unless you get out. And then, of course, when you get out, then you're like 80 years old and.
If you
double
get out.
whammy, yeah.
The big thing is, if you get out, what if you don't? Then you're just gonna just live there forever until you're dead.
You might not have to pay taxes.
So is there anything we could do to encourage a fairy ring? No, seriously.
On people we don't like,
Probably
no.
more of if you do have any things that are decaying, like the logs, or even, I believe, what is it, they say things like composting and
Mhm.
things that will help with that.
In
Because
Florida,
the big
Brian.
example that I can find that, I don't know if they fall under like fairy rings, but I remember when when he was speaking at, which ritual was that?
Oh,
Or in the
Pagan
Christ-
Pride?
Yeah.
Yeah, Nathan Hall.
Yes, when Nathan was speaking
Yeah.
about it, where he's talking about the stink,
The
Yeah.
state
Yeah.
mushrooms?
yes, the stink mushrooms. Where he's talking about that, where you can find them just in a flooded yard or a
Yeah,
yard
I
that.
get them, I get them in my yard.
That's right.
And they're beautiful.
Yeah.
They are beautiful. The first time I saw it, I'm like, what the heck is that? And I went over and I touched it and it just like. The powder comes up and it collapses where you touch it. But I took a picture of it and sent it to the Broward extension. And they sent me a reply right away.
Wash your hands.
Yeah, lick your fingers.
It's
Yeah,
a
right.
mushroom and I'm like, that's a mushroom?
It's cool.
But it is, they're real.
And then only too, you know, a lot of us use mulch in our yards and I don't remove the old mulch, I, you know, I work it in a little bit. And I know that especially right after the rainy season, you can see the layer, the white layer
Mhm.
Mhm.
through it.
It starts growing on.
Yeah.
That sounds
Especially if
like
it
a
gets wet.
wonderful Green Man Alliance project. Let's get a log and save our composting and see if we can create a fairy ring.
Yeah, mushrooms tend to be able to grow in any environment.
Such a bad idea.
I mean, anything would
I'll
here
wait-
as it
I'll wait
rots,
till you ask for
if it's not
questions.
been treated.
Yeah,
Yeah, we
It will-
have areca palms. And when one dies, Steve just chops it up, we use it as borders around, and they all have mushrooms growing.
there you go.
They look
And
like,
remember,
they
with
look
it
like
being
reishi
fungi,
mushrooms too.
Mushrooms are opportunists.
with it being fungi, they're gonna just spread out through that area and
Oh, yeah.
you're just seeing the upper layer of it. You're just seeing the mushrooms.
Yeah, I just
There's
found it.
big
It's like feet deep down in the
Oh,
yard.
and it smells so good when you get into that layer where the mushrooms are and it's just all decaying and rotting and smelling of.
Just
of
thought of
fungi.
something infected or something so magical. You get the mushrooms
The
on that
ferment-
thing,
the
and then you
fermented
use the
herb.
log with the mushroom on it magically,
so
you
good.
kind of intertwine it kind of thing.
I could just sit there and sniff it.
Next.
Yeah, next slide.
Okay.
I think there's one more, I believe. And that was some more of the other examples. Now, I believe if I remember right, the one on the far right was the more positive. The other two were more of showing other examples that they were giving of what would happen if you were to enter within a fairy ring.
Call for Evelina and ask for an airlift.
The green man is hanging out with him in this one.
GPS doesn't work in here, I wonder why.
No.
The ones that you see most, now the interesting thing is you see for France and Germany is that they had it as a witches circle, so they're attributing it to witches and then,
We get around.
yeah.
Mhm.
Well, they don't have
That's why it's a circle.
well, they have
I'm on phone.
fairy tales and
Fairies,
stuff
but
like that,
their
but not,
theories are not quite.
not
the same.
like in Ireland and the Celtic areas, they're like,
No.
and I have I have a friend that I see at craft shows sometimes. Her name is Colleen Scarlett. Imagine what her background is, and she goes, people put milk out for the Fae. People encourage the Fae to come to their homes and their gardens. And she's like, it drives me crazy. No, my
just don't
grandmother
know.
is turning in her grave. You leave that alone. You don't want to mess with the Fae.
Yeah.
So, should I stop to share? Or-
So is there any question from the folks online or?